Maybe while people, did you guys already have a plan? Did you have nothing? Okay.
One thing is, if people in the congregation want to ask a question, they need to use one of these microphones, or they won't be heard on Zoom.
Okay, before I'll say anything, I'll run out one more time and yell at everybody.
Were both of you recently laid off? Were both you and your partner recently laid off?
Oh, yes,
And I already forgot your partner's name, so I
Leslie.
apologize.
Leslie, yes. Yes, we both lost our jobs March 8th, I think, around there.
That must have been a shock.
Well, no, we kind of saw it coming, but still shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not the first time that, we've sort of been between assignments overseas and had some time to recharge the batteries and whatnot. But yeah, that's always been voluntary when we've chosen to do it. So this time it was a bit shocking.
Unless you're going to cover it during your talk, could you tell us a little bit of what you were doing in the Ukraine?
Yeah, actually, I probably won't get that far in the talk. I was taking a look at some of the work that USAID was doing in Ukraine, and we've been at it for 10 years on the front line since 2014, when Russia took the Crimea and some of the territory in the east before the 2022 full-scale invasion. And I was just trying to prepare the team out there for whatever was coming next. And in the context of a new administration, it's normal to sort of brace yourselves to go in a different direction. And combined with the stress and the trauma of all the work that they've done over all the years, I was essentially sent out to help them prepare for all the uncertainty. And so we took a look at some of the structures of the organization that we had set up, some of the work that we were doing, talked to Ukrainians and people in the embassy and others, and said, okay, well, for example, if there's a peace deal or some sort of ceasefire, the Ukrainians might want to hold elections, except 30,000 polling places have been utterly destroyed. And if you gather people in large groups, it's an invitation for Russian airstrikes. So how could we hold an election? First and foremost, on the peace deal itself, there'd probably be a referendum. And then, of course, when the war started in 22, Zelensky suspended the constitution and elections. So Ukrainians are overdue. They're overdue for presidential elections, parliamentary elections, and local elections. But the logistics alone of conducting an election in the middle of a war zone are rather daunting. As we found out in Afghanistan in 2004, where we had to have the U.S. military literally helicoptering ballot boxes around to get them to counting centers and whatnot. Elections are a lot of work. The elections in Ukraine are overdue. And so we said, okay, well, if they ask us for help in holding these elections, if they ask us for help on this front or that front with food or fuel or whatever, how can we prepare ourselves? How can we work through the scenarios, to figure out what we needed to do next? Right now, the efforts I'm looking at were the last 6 or 8 months have really been to get frontline communities in Ukraine through this winter. So there's been a lot of support with fuel vouchers, generators and other equipment that's been damaged by airstrikes. Essentially, the Ukrainians, sorry, I'm going off on quite a tangent here, but the Ukrainians don't have the military wherewithal to hold a lot of the territory that they've taken back from the Russians. So it's got to be civilians. And that's who we, USAID, work with, civilian mayors and community leaders who are there on the front lines because that's their community and that's where they're going to live. And so whatever we can do to support them. But in the current context back in January of a new administration, a possible ceasefire or peace deal, as well as a worst case scenario of increased fighting in the springtime when the snow melts and the mud dries up. There's a annual seasonal cycle to conflict in most countries. because military operations can't be conducted in the wintertime. So the worst case scenario was to prepare them this spring for renewed offenses and the loss of territory. And again, this is all in the context of a lot of those people, the Ukrainians who work for us, especially, they've been at it for 10 years. They're all burnout, stressed. You can see it in their faces, the way they talk. We do a lot with staff care. We have a counselor to deal with the trauma. We do a lot for our own staff to keep them productive and to keep them healthy. They mostly work from their homes around Ukraine. And it's just little things they appreciate, like having 2 phone lines, 2 cellular phone services, because one system's towers are probably going to be damaged on any given day by airstrikes. So they can still communicate, they can still send their reports and so forth from the field and keep in touch with the other cellular service.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, it's been quite a ride for USAID in Ukraine the last 10 years.
So, hey, Nick.
Yeah.
So we got people here and people online. I'll just do a short introduction, and then you can introduce yourself. But Nick and I were pretty close friends, and for me, the Peace Corps was super formative, as you already know, because you've heard me preach forever, and I always tell the stories about it. But Nick and I ran around together quite a bit. I mean, we're stationed in different places in the country, but when we had free time, we were together quite a bit. And so we had a couple of memorable trips together. We went through, I had a vacation, a couple of week vacation. So I went from, the Caribbean side of Guatemala, and I was going up to Puerto Escondido in Oaxaca, Mexico. And I had agreed with Nick and 2 other lady Peace Corps volunteers that we would meet in Puerto Escondido. They didn't have as much vacation as me, but they were closer to the border. So they were going to come up and meet me, but it turned out that I got to the Guatemalan-Mexican border, and a hurricane had blown out the road in 6 different places. So 6 bridges were knocked out, so I got to the bus station, and the bus said, "There's no way to go north." But we had, we were young and dumb, and we knew that campesinos, or peasants, they don't worry about roads and bridges. If they want to move, they figure out a way to do it. So I hitchhiked 300 miles in a day. I crossed 6 blown out rivers with hurricane swelling waters. So I had 12 hitchhikes on each side of the river, and I made it up, and I told him I'd meet him at this little hippie beach called Cipolote in Mexico, and I was sitting there waiting for 3 days for them to come, and I finally was going to give up, and so I packed my stuff and started walking out, and I'm walking the 3 kilometers to the road where I can get a bus going north to the surf spot, and they pulled up in a little Volkswagen Beetle. It turned out they found out there was the hurricane. They rented a car, drove all the way to like Cancun, all the way to the East Coast, and then drove around. Then the other one that was significant was that I went down very nervous and terrified, and asked my wife to marry me, and then Nick and I went down to El Salvador together after that. So it was my last trip as a bachelor. We did together, and we got in the bus, and it was a little chicken bus, like a school bus, packed to the complete brim, like a Guinness Book of World Record, packed, like 80 people in a 50-person bus or something like that. And so it was so hot, and we could barely breathe. So we asked the ayudante, the person, if we could go right on the roof. So we went up and sat on the luggage and drove down the coast of El Salvador, on the luggage rack. So anyway, that's Nick, and good to see you, Nick. Thank you for coming along. Go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Max. Yeah, the the key word in that story is hurricane. We were just foolish to think that we could go surfing in southern Mexico during Hurricane Hugo in 1988, which some of you are old enough to remember was a big one. So no, I really appreciate you guys having me here today. And Max, it's just so wonderful to be back in touch with you, my friend. This is something that I've done a lot of over the years when I'm back in the United States from overseas. And it's a takeaway from Peace Corps, the third goal of the Peace Corps, which it really is why the Peace Corps enjoys over decades strong bipartisan support in Congress, is because the real beneficiary of the Peace Corps is not people overseas. It's the United States. It's what we do when we get back, and that exposure overseas and to the world has given us a broader perspective and makes us better citizens when we get back to the United States. It's been my experience in many conflict countries and countries in transition around the world that informed citizens are an essential part of a healthy democracy and a healthy society. So I thank you for your interest in foreign aid and USAID, and I thank you for having me here today.
And who are you with?
Leslie, my girlfriend, partner, and better half of the last 15 or 20 years.
Hi, Leslie.
A lot of similar work. Peace Corps was very formative. Like Max, it was, my experience was very life-changing. But prior to that, I really have to give credit to my parents, because they set an amazing example and were incredible role models in terms of community activism and community service. As I mentioned earlier, then I went to Notre Dame, where I got interested in the asylum movement that you all helped start in the 1980s in Central America. And I learned really quickly at Notre Dame that community service was an informal requirement to graduate. I did scouting because I had done it when I was a kid. So all of that made Peace Corps Guatemala, kind of a natural for me. And I guess the life-altering experience I had was that it was the first time I had seen real poverty. I grew up in Ohio on the fringes of Appalachia, and I thought I had seen some pretty poor people in my time, but as you know, from Central America, we're talking about less than $1 a day type poverty. It shook me. It moved me to pursue the career that I have. And so after getting a master's degree after Peace Corps, I went off to Bosnia during the war to do humanitarian work for the International Rescue Committee, a wonderful New York-based NGO. Despite the risks, I really loved that kind of work, because you can see the immediate life-saving impact that providing food, clothing, and shelter has on people and their appreciation. Still, one of the lessons I learned in Bosnia is that however well-intentioned, aid can also exacerbate and prolong conflict, and it certainly did in Bosnia. What we now call conflict sensitivity is just a common sense idea that we need to better understand what is driving conflict, the grievances and dynamics involved in the society. It's not always practiced, but I think everybody would agree with that sentiment. I then spent a few years with Save the Children, another wonderful NGO in the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. I spent a few in New York City looking for an AIDS vaccine. And then a brief stint in West Bank, Gaza with a for-profit contractor. One thing I would note about the vaccine work is that this was the late 90s, and that was the beginning of the Gates Foundation focus on what are called the three big orphan diseases: malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS. Those are, as I learned at the time, those are good examples of of market failure. However much faith we put in the private sector and free enterprise to come up with solutions to problems, and I think most Americans, I put a lot of faith in the private sector and do a lot of private sector promotion around the world. But sometimes, in the case of a vaccine, for example, there is a market for it. There are tens of millions of people in the developing world who suffer from AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. The problem is they can't afford to buy a vaccine. So interestingly, 1998, when we started working on an AIDS vaccine, is also the year that Viagra came out. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out why the big pharmaceutical companies and biotechs are coming out with Viagra and not a vaccine for HIV/AIDS. It's also worth noting because the Gates Foundation and others, with the closure of USAID, will feel a lot of pressure to do more. And I hope that they do. But whether they do and whether that's a good thing or not, what they do, where they do it, all that remains to be seen. The point I'm making is simply that the Gates Foundation and others are not necessarily aligned with US foreign policy interests the way that USAID is. A good example is George Soros Open Society Institute, which is, I think, has done amazing work in Eastern Europe with civil society and free media, government accountability, et cetera. And yet Soros is a pretty controversial figure, and the work that they do, the Open Society Institute, is often criticized by people in those countries for a variety of reasons. Next comes what I referred to, Leslie and I both referred to as the GWAT years. This would be George Bush's global war on terror, 3 years in Afghanistan, a year in Iraq, 4 in Pakistan. We were essentially following the lead of the US military, and we were there to support the troops. But rest assured, the strategy, the focus, that was all being driven by the Department of Defense, not USAID or the State Department. And it was an explicit attempt to use foreign assistance to achieve political and security outcomes rather than just development outcomes. Now, in practice, I would say it's not that cut and dry. It's certainly not mutually exclusive. You can have good development outcomes, reducing infant mortality, introducing potable water, et cetera, while also having political and security outcomes. You might be doing that water system in a village in the border of Pakistan that's controlled by the Taliban, and you would use that in order to essentially win the hearts and minds of the people in that village back over to the government side, the government that we were supporting. Not us. We weren't doing those and saying, hey, these are from the American people, USAID. We were doing them on behalf of the Pakistani government that we were supporting, and whose writ and legitimacy we were trying to extend into these areas which have been a safe haven for terrorism. It's where we all thought Osama bin Laden was hiding, that he was 30 miles up the road from Islamabad in a nice, lovely little house. Just didn't occur to anyone. It's been a little controversial, this sort of security-related work, particularly among NGOs and UN agencies. Getting the US military involved in foreign assistance, they say, is compromising their humanitarian neutrality and objectivity. They're not wrong. The reality, though, is that the military is often working in places where the NGOs can't work, and it's sometimes doing things like training the police that the NGOs don't want to do. So in my mind, in Afghanistan, in the context of Afghanistan and Iraq and some of the other places I've worked, we still need to try to save lives. We still need to try to improve lives. The means by which we get there sometimes require that we get the US military involved. This, by the way, was all based on an official shift in the doctrine of the United States government that happened every 4 years. There is a national security strategy. Every 4 years, the Pentagon does a quadrennial defense review. State and AID do a quadrennial diplomacy and development review. It all comes together in the national security strategy of the United States, which sets out what the major threats are and how we're preparing for them. In 2002, there was a tectonic shift, and suddenly development, AID, became one of the 3 Ds. So defense, diplomacy, development, or what we later started calling just a more of a whole of government approach. The idea is that we can't just sit around anymore. The problems we're facing in the world are too complex, too thorny to just say, hey, I'm doing this, what are you doing? The idea of the 3D doctrine was to get the defense agencies and the diplomatic agencies and development agencies to conduct joint analysis of the problem, joint planning and implementation, and then joint assessment of whether or not we're having the results that we intend, and how can we do better. To give an example of this, I was briefly in Afghanistan in charge of an interagency transfer to the Federal Aviation Administration. I know nothing about civilian aviation. It was like a tag, you're it, Nick. Why don't you go handle the paperwork on this? The reason we needed FAA in Kabul is that the Taliban had no interest or capability in controlling the airspace over their country. And so after the war, we were trying to get civilian airlines to come back into Kabul, and we needed the FAA. So a bit of paperwork, and $1 million later, we had transferred some money, and they sent somebody out. All told, there are about 12 or 13 federal agencies that have a major stake, major programs active internationally. Treasury, Commerce, there's an entire Foreign Agricultural Service in the Department of Agriculture, whose job it is to open up foreign markets for U.S. agricultural produce. So there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen. After the GWOT came the Arab Spring. I did a lot of work at this point. By this time, I had become, a sort of more of a part-time senior advisor with USAID, and I was going in and out of places like Somalia and Syria and Libya. I think what I took away from those is the need for strategic patience, which the U.S. government doesn't have a whole lot of. My talking point in Mogadishu with the ambassador and others was, look, Rome wasn't built in a day. If you do the math, Somalia has been the poster child for a failed state for over a generation since the Black Hawk Down days in the early 90s, right? Most Somalis are under the age of 25. That's just the demographic reality. So most Somalis don't have any living memory of what it's like to pay taxes or interact with a policeman or a government official. That's just not part of their reality, and hasn't been for so long that thinking that USAID would come in and other donors, UN agencies, et cetera, and within a few years we're going to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and Somalia would be a functioning nation state. It's just no small feat. This kind of work. It takes years, sometimes generations, and you make 2 steps forward and 1 back, or 3 sideways. Most recently, I've spent a lot of time in West Africa, around the Lake Chad Basin. That's kind of one of the new fights with extremism. And there's a great deal of political and economic instability in West Africa. There have been 3 coups in the last 5 years, military coups. There have been French, British, American, and now Russian military interventions in places like Mali and Niger. Nothing has worked. Extremism is spreading around the Lake Chad Basin and further afield in West Africa. The interesting part is that relative to the Middle East and all the work I did in those places, extremism is far less ideological in West Africa, and it really stems from historical grievances and more political and economic dynamics. The places where you have a Muslim minority, even though the school of Islam is not one of the more radical ones, it's the West African Moroccan school. But the place where you have Muslim minorities, 10-20% of the population in places like Ghana, those are also places that have been historically marginalized. The capital and the political centers are further down on the coast. The ports and economic centers and big cities are on the coast. The minority populations and the places where extremism is taking root on top of organized crime are much more in the north of those countries. And the way the British and French carved up West Africa, all these countries are long and narrow with a little bit of coastline, and then they usually follow the path of a river down to the ocean. But literally, I mean, another thing I would say about that is that Lake Chad itself, it's literally drying up. It's going the way of the Aral Sea. So, I'm not going to talk about climate change or anything. I'm just going to say that stresses on the environment I just want to say that the stresses on the environment and environmental factors are now something that we USAID consider to be a significant driver of conflict around the world. It's really about land use. So if you look at conflict in the middle belt of Nigeria, for example, it's between semi-nomadic pastoralists, the Fulani, who happen to be Muslims, and it's violence against mostly sedentary farmers who tend to be Christians. It's not that cut and dry or anything, but it's easy to see how population pressures and pressures on land use is fomenting conflict. And some of that is just being driven by climate change. That such places are fertile breeding ground for violent extremism should come as no surprise. Yesterday was blood diamonds in places like Liberia. Today it's illegal gold mining in Burkina Faso. The root causes in both are really poor to non-existent governance. And as I will talk a little bit later on why foreign assistance matters, there's really no military solution to the problem of growing extremism and instability in much of West Africa. So that's it. As I mentioned earlier, last year, I had been in the private sector for a number of years. When we moved back here, I went back into government service, got my security clearance and my diplomatic passport back, just in time to work for about 3 months before I was fired when aid closed. So we'll see how all this plays out. But you know, when I was in Ukraine, as I said, we were talking through many different scenarios. What would we do in the event of peace? What would we do in the event of, you know, increasing war? What would we do if we had this much money or that much money? At no point did any of us think that it would come to this, that the answer to the questions of what is going to come next and how can we, you know, how can we help Ukraine was to simply pack up and go home and abandon our friends. I would have never guessed that this would have been the outcome. Normally, every 4 or 8 years, when a new administration comes in, there is almost always a process by which we reinvent government and identify areas of duplication and waste. Every 4 or 8 years, we listen to the priorities of the new administration, the political imperatives, and where they want to work and what they want to do, and we respond accordingly. That's what we do. So I just never would have imagined that it would have been that the United States would have effectively stopped all foreign assistance, $40 to $60 billion in recent years, and that's exactly what has happened now. That leads me to USAID. So let me talk a little bit about its history, how it works, and then why foreign aid matters. The caveat in talking about aid is that my experience is probably somewhat unique in that most people at aid don't do this much work in this many conflict and transition countries. You know, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where aid by necessity tends to operate a little differently than it does in more normative environments. Some of the rules go out the window. I won't say that we cut corners, but we expedite certain procedures that would normally be somewhat bureaucratic, but in the interest of the term is compelling foreign policy interest. And it is often a compelling foreign policy interest to say, not fully compete an award, but to just do a limited competition among a few firms or a few NGOs that we know do, let's say, good health related work. So that just expedites. We can go from, let's say, an 18 to 24 month timeline to get that program in place and do it in, you know, in less than 6. So I've never been a member of the Foreign Service or the Civil Service. They form the core of USAID in the State Department. I've always been a non-career employee. I have spent on nearly 15 years working directly with USAID. I've also worked, as I mentioned, Save the Children, IRC. I've worked for 2 for-profit organizations. And of course, over the course of a long career, you just become familiar with, you know, sort of the whole diverse ecosystem around USAID. USAID was created in 1960 with the Foreign Assistance Act, and this was concurrent with the creation of the Peace Corps and a number of other reforms and consolidation of existing efforts at that time. The important context to remember about AID's creation in 1960 is the Cold War. AID was legally, for many years, prohibited from working in communist countries. That changed in 1990, of course, but it was all about the Cold War. So what you really have to look back to the Marshall Plan after World War II for sort of the intellectual antecedents of USAID and the idea of foreign assistance. My personal view, you know, there's no way to prove this, but I think that if the Marshall Plan had not succeeded as it had after World War II in Europe and Japan, I'm not sure that there would ever have been a USAID or that the United States would become the largest single donor in the world. It's also interesting to point out that George Marshall and Harry Truman, when they were selling the plan, it's called the European Reconstruction Administration, when they were selling that to Congress and the American people, it was a pretty tough sell. As you can imagine, you know, people would say, but the Germans and Japanese and Italian, they were all shooting at us a few years ago. Why should we help them? Why should, you know, we're starting to enjoy the good life at the, you know, the 1950s and prosperity. And why should we suffer higher taxes in order to pay for, the folly of Europe starting all of these wars? Marshall and Truman really sold it, though. And the reason I bring that up is that they are the last administration to sell foreign assistance to the American people. It just doesn't happen anymore. So AID was an easy target for Elon Musk and Doge to go after because we don't really have a domestic constituency. As one former head of USAID put it recently, foreign aid was just something that there was a consensus around among politicians of all stripes, again, across administrations and decades, and policymakers, think tanks, and experts. I agree, obviously, and again, I'll talk a little bit more later about why I think it matters. But at the same time, despite that broad consensus that the United States, the richest, most powerful country in the history of the world, why we shouldn't be, giving back, let's say, less than 1/10 of 1% of our federal budget to people who are less fortunate than us. Despite that broad consensus, there was also from the beginning a lot of criticism and calls for reform of foreign assistance. So in the initial years in the 1960s, aid focused a lot on infrastructure and at the macro level on economic growth. The idea was they were called Rostovian stages of growth. There was this guy, Walt Rostow, who worked. He's just like brilliant guy in the Kennedy administration, wrote this super influential book that was essentially like a free market manifesto. And I think manifesto was in the title, free market manifesto to counter the communists. That in retrospect was probably a little bit naive. The results by the end of the 60s were mixed. So under the Carter administration, USAID switched gears pretty significantly. We went from sort of macro level stuff to at the micro level meeting basic human needs. So health, education, food aid, etc. And then in the Reagan era, we got heavily involved in business support and private sector growth. Good thing in my view. And surprisingly for Ronald Reagan, I would have thought Carter did this, but Reagan really started a lot of our democracy promotion around the world. After the Cold War ended, that what we now call democracy, human rights, and governance work really took off in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And then, as my experience demonstrates, after 9/11, USAID pivoted again quite significantly to support counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, countering violent extremism, stabilization, more security oriented. Notably, it was in the 1980s when USAID also switched its business model from one where we did a number of things ourselves, but then we also funded other organizations. And that's kind of the model that a lot of larger UN agencies continue to use. Now USAID is really just a donor. We don't do much ourselves. Some parts of the agency are way more operational and hands-on than others. And as you would imagine, that this sort of approach has been criticized as outsourcing foreign aid. In my view, it's actually a pretty good division of labor. And by comparison, since federal employment numbers have been in the news a lot of late, the Veterans Administration is one of the largest civilian agencies in the federal government. It has something like 400,000 or 500,000 employees. But that's because the VA actually operates its hospitals. All the staff in those hospitals are VA employees. AID's approach would be to essentially contract the operation of the hospital out to a professional hospital company or nonprofit, which is what most of them are here. And that's why our employment numbers are much less than the VA. This was in the context in the 1980s of a senator from North Carolina named Jesse Helms, who, again, many of you might remember. He wanted to stop. He was the first person, I think, to make a major effort and get pretty far advanced in eliminating foreign aid and closing USAID. What he did manage to do in the 1980s was significantly reduce the core of the foreign service officers who were constituting USAID staff. So in some sense, this shift in business model from doing things to funding things and being a donor, it was by necessity. The reason I think it works pretty well is that at this point, the USAID focuses on policy, long-term strategy, the technical aspects of what is often very challenging work in very difficult environments. Our implementing partners they carry out the day-to-day work, and they often do so in places where we official Americans with diplomatic passports were simply not allowed to go anymore. So to talk a little bit more about that ecosystem, I think it's appropriately diverse. The organizations that work with or for USAID, probably the best known of our partners are the big international NGOs like CARE and Save the Children and Doctors Without Borders. But we also work with, behemoth construction companies. Bechtel rebuilt the port of Basra in Iraq for us after the war in record time, and frankly, only Bechtel could have done that. We had KPMG come in and the consulting company, and they put together the central bank. And one of the unsung stories or underreported stories in Iraq and Afghanistan is that after the war, neither country really suffered from the kind of macroeconomic instability, hyperinflation, and all that stuff that you are normally associated with wars and conflict. USAID also uses for-profit companies, and some of those, and that's been criticized, but frankly, the margins that those guys worked for two of those, and Leslie worked for one for the last 15 years. Frankly, the margins are pretty slim. That's not why they do the work to get rich. The contractual arrangement with aid means that we, AID, can control those firms to a far greater degree than we can Save the Children. It's just the contractual arrangement, the way it works. And they're used to that. So when we jump, they say, ha ha. If I ask Save the Children to jump, they'd say, yeah, we'll think about it. We'll get back to you. They probably would at the end of the day, but we don't. But legally, contractually, we don't have the same level of control or influence. And in very dynamic, very high risk conflict zones, the US government wants that kind of control. We need it because we need to pivot or adapt or stop or start or increase or decrease what we're doing, sometimes day to day. Other partners include fine academic institutions. Texas A&M is renowned for its agriculture studies and has a strong interest in Latin America, so they get involved in a number of projects. We have a ton of local NGOs around the world and companies as well in host countries, think tanks and policy institutes, et cetera, an impressive number of small and disadvantaged businesses, as well as a number of UN and multilateral organizations. USAID in many of the places we work is the largest or one of the largest donors. But what really made this more of an ecosystem, now which is largely collapsed and in crisis, is it wasn't just the tens of thousands of us or the organizations that worked for with USAID. It was the knowledge that we have of USAID regulations, business practices, systems, et cetera. And that includes audit and financial management standards, transparent negotiated cost structures, including salary caps, and everything we do to monitor and provide oversight of taxpayer resources. That, by the way, usually involves aid, its partners, host country, and usually third parties as well. Generally speaking, my experience over the last 30 years is that USAID is far more transparent and far more accountable than other foreign affairs entities, CIA, DOD, State Department, et cetera. And I am taking into account the sensitive nature of the work that they do and the national security considerations with the military. Frankly, the military sweeps too much under the carpet under the guise of, well, we had to waste a bunch of money because lives were at stake. Well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, or maybe we just should have thought it through, or maybe, you should have sent the aid person, instead of the captain. But the message I really want to hammer home here is that anyone who has worked for AID, anyone I've known, including myself, we take really seriously that we are stewards of public trust and public funds, and we do all we can to ensure that our efforts are effective. The president's charge that we're a bunch of radical lunatics who've gone off the reservation, wasting taxpayer money, that's just patently absurd. Fraud and abuse sometimes happens, but you'd be surprised at how rare it is. Anyway, that ecosystem took decades to evolve. And despite the inevitable downsides and trade-offs, it was working reasonably well and could have been reformed, which again is what usually happens every 4 or 8 years. The folly of destroying it, as the Trump administration has, is that it will take years to rebuild. And in the meantime, to put it bluntly, the Trump administration has one fewer instrument of national power to wield in the world. That's unfortunate. one that for the most part does a whole lot of good. And we're talking about less than, it's usually 0.2 to 0.3% of the federal budget, about 40 to 50, last year 60 billion. That really depends on how many disasters and conflicts there are in the world. To give you an example of the good work that aid does, you may be familiar with the Syrian Civil Defense, the white helmets. Has anyone heard of them? That was us. That was USAID. We didn't start it because, frankly, the best ideas are those that come spontaneously from Syrians on the ground. Hey, we need to pull people out of buildings that have collapsed. And they had some semblance of a civil defense. What we did is, just come in and provide the funding, some technical assistance, some organizational support, and then we handed it over to other donors. So, we really got the ball rolling with the white helmets, and then we left it to others to continue that work. It's the way this is supposed to happen. And the white helmets, in case you don't know, a number of years ago were nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. They do fantastic work. But to get back to the main point here, USAID's budget, our priority countries, the areas of technical focus, they evolve as administrations change over the years. Simply put, USAID is an executive branch agency, and we take our priorities primarily from the White House, but are also accountable to Congress and the American people. It's not a big NGO like CARE, Save the Children. That's one of the sort of misperceptions around USAID. Last thing I want to say about aid is that under the Biden administration in the last 4 years or so, but really starting under the Trump 1 administration, the value of DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. In a domestic context, we can debate that all we want. Personally, I'm all in, but I can also acknowledge that maybe my attitudes are ahead of the mainstream of the American public. That's domestically. Internationally, DEIA is a no-brainer. And the reason is simply that a lot of the places we work, it is fundamental to addressing conflict and poverty. Women, most notably, are often absent or excluded from a lot of the work, a lot of the things that we do around the world. Sorry. It's Washington, so we have a lot of helicopters overhead. You just get used to it. But women, ethnic, religious, and other minorities, those who have been oppressed, those who have been marginalized, this creates grievances. It creates conflict. It perpetuates poverty. We don't have time to get into all of this, but DEIA for me has been extremely welcome in the context of the work that the USAID does around the world. So finally, I know I've taken up a lot of time, but finally, why foreign assistance matters. First, and I think this is going to be totally obvious to this group, first and foremost, it's just the right thing to do. We are a country founded on Judeo-Christian traditions and principles, and one of those is certainly to help people in need. I mean, it's, Max said it in the sermon, when you were hungry, I gave you food, and thirsty, something to drink. The basic idea of to each according to their needs and from each according to their abilities is the basis upon which USAID operates. To me, this is as obvious as the sun in the sky, and I think for many of you as well. And it's really the only reason a lot of us have ever needed or wanted to do the work that we do. And I say this, far less naive than I was 30 some years ago in the Peace Corps when me and Max and a lot of other people set out to change the world. But, I feel pretty good about the work that I've done in my little corner of the world and the positive impact that it has had. So again, foreign assistance for the richest, most powerful country in the history of the world, and then I would argue the most benevolent or benign power that has ever emerged. Foreign assistance is just the right thing to do. But that's not the end of the story, because as I've said, aid is an executive branch agency, and foreign aid has also and always been used to exert soft or what we now call smart power in the world. The Trump administration is skeptical about this. There are people who, frankly, I think don't believe in soft power and influence around the world, but we in the United States have a great deal of it, not just because we spend more on our military than every other country combined. I don't have a problem with peace through strength. The problem I have, the fundamental issue I have, is that not every problem in the world has a military solution. Um, and here the old adage applies that if the only tool you have is a hammer, it's tempting to see everything as a nail. So if the Trump administration is going to rely primarily upon the diplomatic corps or the US military, to exert its influence and affect change and catalyze change around the world, okay. It's just not the right tool if what you're trying to do is eliminate poverty or be more inclusive with a marginalized group like women and get them involved in microfinance schemes, for example. And I say this because even the military knows that it's often not the best instrument or the best institution or agency of the federal government to do foreign assistance. They're often invaluable. Their logistics and communication and security related support is often a key part of the work that aid does, especially in disasters. But the military is not who you want to figure out, okay, after this crisis is over, what do we do now? How do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? How do we rebuild this country? That requires civilian expertise. And the first people who point that out are the US military. They have often been our USAID's strongest advocate for the work that we do. And that's not surprising because the U.S. military is in hundreds of countries and is just got so much on its plate right now. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza was right when she famously said that it's not the job of the 82nd Airborne to escort kids to school. As you all remember, that's exactly what they did, though, until USAID stepped up and got basic education programs going again. And then we didn't really need the 82nd Airborne to do that kind of work. The thing is that in conflict and post-conflict environments, the state, the government, often does not have a monopoly on the use of violence, which all states have to maintain. And so often where the police are seen and the army is seen as corrupt or predatory or inefficient, after a regime change or a war, someone basically has to get basic services back online, some semblance of governance, economic opportunity, sort of priming the pump to get the economy working again. As you would imagine, most of that work falls to USAID. It's in our interest as a nation to do that because nature abhors a vacuum. After a conflict or a regime change, there is a vacuum. There's also an opportunity, we call it the golden hour, to affect change. It's when the population of a country is tired of conflict and war, wants the problems resolved, and is willing to accept significant reform or change in how they're governed or how the government works. That's exactly the point at which AID intervenes. And if we don't, the Chinese will. If we don't, organized criminal networks will fill the vacuum. If we don't, international terrorist organizations will fill that vacuum. But again, nature abhors a vacuum, and someone has to provide some semblance of law and order. Someone has to provide some semblance of economic opportunity. Someone has to provide some semblance of whatever form of governance, from dictatorship to democracy, that the people of that country choose to follow. That's, I think, in many places, that's where aid is really, I've seen aid be at its finest, is in those situations. Good examples are Syria and Libya. I needed the Venn diagram in those places to keep track of the alphabet soup of militias and political movements and foreign backers associated with the various parties to the conflict. And that was just, again, a superficial understanding. Among the big powers, the big powers countering Russian and now Chinese influence have been explicit in recent objectives of US foreign policy. And I could discuss the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative all day. I find it fascinating for reasons both good and bad. At a lower level, it's also noteworthy that in places like Syria, you had interventions both militarily and in terms of funding or civilian assistance from Turkey, the Gulf states, and others. So all this is by way of saying that, you know, USAID is not the only, and the US government is not the only game in town around the world. We increasingly, and in a way that I didn't really see so much of during the Cold War and the beginning of my career, we have to compete for influence and power in the world these days. The third and final reason I would give for why foreign assistance matters is because it works. And it's cost effective. It's a whole lot more cost effective than sending in the troops and the aircraft carriers and the F-35s. That stuff, you know, costs an arm and a leg. Food aid, I think, has been very successful, even though there's some issues with it in terms of dependency. Yeah, and of course, it benefits American farmers who are the best in the world, or among the best in the world. Even better are famine and disease surveillance systems, early warning systems that prevent major sufferings before it happens. There was a major outbreak of Ebola in 2014, and I was in, Leslie and I were in Pakistan at the time, but I thought I saw a figure that AIDS response cost on the order of about $1 billion. That is a lot of money for a disease outbreak, primarily in Africa. But when you compare it to the cost of the COVID pandemic or the AIDS pandemic at its height in the late 90s, that's not very much money to prevent an outbreak of Ebola in 2014, and that's exactly what we did. I would also point out that PEPFAR, which is now suspended and whose future is uncertain, PEPFAR is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and the president in question was the younger George Bush. Again, surprising, but under a Republican, he started this wonderful initiative to provide treatment drugs to people who, again, can't afford them in the developing world, because many of us at that time were arguing that the AIDS pandemic was so bad in certain places in sub-Saharan Africa, that it wasn't just a public health crisis, it was a national security crisis. The level of the pandemic was such that it was undermining the stability of some nation states. We saw that again during COVID. A few teetered, and quite a few chose COVID as cover to pursue some nefarious activities. So just to wrap it up here, you know, what I would say is that foreign assistance can help. And we help in myriad ways. We do technology transfer and capacity building. We provide the incentives and we catalyze the host government to pursue the right policies and the right practices. And sometimes we have to, and we do intervene on their behalf to handle a major natural disaster, for example, because there are very few governments around the world in poor countries that have anything like FEMA. You know, I could go on and on and on all day about all of the wins and all the successes that we've had with foreign assistance programs. But the one condition I would put on that is that they are very rarely decisive in and of themselves. What matters most, I think, in the places where aid works is the host country's own policies, their own politics and political economy, the resources, including human resources in that country, as well as that country's particular history and geography and culture and so on and so forth. Foreign assistance can really help, but that's really what it's all about. It's the host country and the people of that country and their desire. We USAID are there to help and facilitate and to reconcile their agenda with US national interests and the US's agenda. And for the last 40, 50, 60 years, I would say that by and large, it has worked as planned. So finally, again, I just want to thank you, and I'll just leave you with one thought, which is go Warriors.
Yeah, God help them. So, questions?
Yeah, I read the National Catholic Reporter, and it's been full of stories about what the work of the National Catholic Catholic organizations that work overseas have been badly undercut with these. And I'm wondering how many of those institutions which aid, which USAID has funded, are in jeopardy because of these cuts.
All of them all of them have lost funding. All of them are suffering because almost all projects that were funded by USAID have just ended without any preparation, without giving any warning in advance to the people in these countries who were implementing them, to the people who were working on the projects, but also to the beneficiaries. From one day to the next, they just weren't receiving funding. A lot of them haven't been paid for work they've already done. So I would say actually, I thought that the faith-based organizations were going to be the only ones to survive, but everything really has been cut. If they were receiving money from the government, that it's all been cut.
Well, the figure I've seen, Bob, is something like over 5,000 contracts and cooperative agreements awards from
Wow.
USAID were canceled, terminated,
Wow.
and less than several. I mean, we're down to like several hundred.
Yeah.
I'm not sure which ones or why, but it's pretty much a complete. I think Secretary Rubio would say that it's a pause or a suspension. I think most of us would say it's the termination.
Yeah.
The intention is to apparently reconstitute foreign assistance within the State Department. But if you've been following the news, the State Department has, its own reforms of diplomatic efforts that the administration at DOGE, is starting to push. The closure of embassies and missions around the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, do they have the capacity and do they have the focus right now on foreign assistance? No. I mean, what started with USAID, in late January has now spread thanks to the work of DOGE throughout the federal government. So everyone's programs, everyone's are being cut, everyone's staff is being cut, et cetera. And honestly, just as a citizen and as a taxpayer, I wish I knew where the Trump administration was going with all of this. I don't. Okay, Republicans like small government. I get it. But the programs you're cutting, the people you're cutting, how is the IRS supposed to collect taxes? How is the Veterans Administration supposed to take care of, our veterans? I kind of felt like, sure, there was always some fat to trim at USAID. There was always some duplication with the State Department, but again, not a whole lot. It's a relatively efficient, relatively effective system that was in place. And I have no idea what, if anything, is going to follow it.
Is the Peace Corps a function of USAID?
No, Peace Corps is an independent agency, but DOGE has paid them a visit, and I'm not sure where things stand on any reforms or restructuring of Peace Corps. I do know that the Return Peace Corps Volunteers Association is watching it like a hawk and is advocating strongly on the Hill and with the administration that Peace Corps, basically don't touch Peace Corps. Peace Corps is sacrosanct, but you could say that about a lot of things that the Trump administration is now cutting.
Okay.
Nick,
I,
quick
Yeah, go ahead.
question or comment or thought. So you mentioned George Bush and Jesse Helms and George Bush's support for AIDS vaccinations. I read a story that one of the reasons for both Helms and Bush supporting AIDS relief in Africa is that the leader of U2, Bono, who was a evangelical Christian, personally met with them and approached them about these sorts of issues of diplomacy and aid relief and medication for people on the basis of their Christian values. And that had a lot to do with these Republican politicians buying into this support and this U.S. aid. Is the current administration even is there a way for Christian leadership or people that can appeal to these leaders on moral and Christian values that might be bring this back to the forefront?
Yes, I was looking at Leslie because she's going to get the sign she made for one of the initial protests at AIDS closure. And it's exactly that argument. It's just the right thing to do. It's the Christian thing to do. I had not heard that story about Bono and PEPFAR and AIDS, but I know Bono was his activism is well known, and HIV/AIDS is one of the causes. So, this is
You can see it's too bright,
Yeah.
but.
so yeah, it's
Glowing. Yeah, you can't see it.
Yeah, yes.
exactly right. So yes, I do think that evangelical, I think the evangelical community, if I can call it that, is a good way to influence the Trump administration. And I think the argument, the more, it's what I refer to as the moral imperative of the work that we do. I think that's a very good way
I
to
think-
get to the administration.
I think we got Dawn, and then Marilyn.
I was hoping that you could name in particular which countries would see USAID as an enemy.
Russia.
We had programs there in the 90s, but they didn't really resonate, and we were never terribly accepted, it seems.
Venezuela.
Nicaragua. We did some work. I did some work in Nicaragua, not in Nicaragua, but with Nicaraguan activists and opposition in 2018 when that crisis hit, when the Ortega regime started to crack down on the protests. But we did it from Honduras and Costa Rica. Low key, quietly. At any given time, there are a number of countries in the world that simply don't want USAID. And there is a certain stigma attached to being a recipient of USAID funding. So as countries get more prosperous, they tend to sort of graduate from being recipients of foreign aid, whether it's American or European or what have you. And that's fine because they can afford to build their own infrastructure and finance their own healthcare and so on and so forth. They don't need us anymore. Sorry.
But for Russia, Venezuela, Salvador, their reasons are quite different. Their reasons are they don't want any guidance on issues like human rights and certain freedoms.
Right.
So they certainly don't want USAID, which normally has significant programs that focus on rights-based issues.
I mean, we could talk all day about Bukele and what he's done in Salvador. Sorry.
I think she was just
Yeah, I
moaning.
just-
Yeah.
Right.
On the one hand, arbitrary detention of, I'm going to guess, at least 100,000 Salvadorans extrajudicially with no due process. I don't like that. On the other hand, crime and violence has been reduced significantly. It basically worked. And the fact that it was an indigenous solution, one that Bukele himself came up with and did, with no involvement on the part of the United States, that too is hard for me to argue with, because like I said, when I was talking about the white helmets in Syria, sometimes we just got to get on the bandwagon. Sometimes we just see good ideas coming from communities or individuals overseas, and we say, yeah, let's do that. I would not have said that, if Bukele had said, okay, well, what about detaining all these people? But again, it has worked, and the public sentiment in El Salvador towards that initiative is extremely strong. So he has created a bit of a quandary for the United States government and for many of us who follow Salvador. I like that there's less crime and violence and people feel safer. I don't like that the cost has been to arbitrarily detain, I'm going to guess, 100,000 of his citizens. But Bukele's one, those are the kind of places where we try to tread lightly often defer to our State Department diplomatic colleagues in dealing with the host government, and try to sometimes draw a fine line or walk a fine line between U.S. and host country interests and priorities. Reconciling those is something that is, is a bit of an art form, but the best people at AID that I've seen and known have been able to do that quite effectively.
So,
Maryland.
can I do a follow-up, one little thing? So it sounds, without knowing much about this, but it sounds like the competition for hearts and minds with the United States is mostly with China these days. And I noticed you didn't mention them as seeing USAID as an enemy.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is because the Chinese model of foreign assistance, the Belt and Road Initiative, is entirely different than AID's business model. The Chinese provide loans. Usually, Chinese companies come in, even with Chinese labor. So thousands of Chinese are traveling to Cameroon. I forget the name of the company. It was a Chinese state-owned company, and they built a new terminal at the international airport in Yaoundé. I don't know what the cost was or anything. It's quite nice, but that's the way their model works. They're funding it, but they're also benefiting from it in the sense of their companies are doing the work, and those companies are employing Chinese. AID's model includes all of that. We use American businesses, and Americans like Leslie and I are employed overseas to manage a lot of that work. But the people we're managing are host country nationals, and they are the overwhelming majority of people who do the overwhelming majority of work. The expatriate or American footprint at most aid missions around the world is pretty minimal, and the programs are largely driven by our local staff, local counterparts in different technical ministries or the prime minister or president's office, et cetera. It's much more. There's much more local ownership, and local ownership or host country ownership has been one of those bedrock good principles of development work for many years, if not decades.
And it's also not a loan.
Right.
When USAID does it, it's not a loan with incredible interest rates, and that's really what China is
Right.
doing. So it's benefiting itself on a number of levels.
They've been accused of creating debt traps for poor countries in Africa. They've actually repossessed ports in Sri Lanka and I think Tanzania or Kenya, one of the two, because those countries couldn't pay off the interest in the loan. So the Chinese now own ports in those countries, and you can imagine the issues of sovereignty and popular pushback, if you will, protest at the idea that, the Chinese, they can't just come in and own our port or our airport. Well, actually they can, and they are. So subscription to the Belt and Road Initiative has really leveled off, if not gone down. And the Chinese, I think, are starting to think about how to reform the approach. They're a big player. They've got a lot of resources. They're very actively involved. A lot of that is around resource extraction to feed the Chinese economy and in industry. From rare earths to whatever, they're a big player in the world today, and their interest and our interest, I wouldn't say they're irreconcilable at all. In fact, quite the opposite. But Chinese interest and American interest, as they play out in some place like El Salvador, or Ecuador or Gaza, they would have to be reconciled somewhat. Their approach and their priorities just often aren't necessarily ours. So the other competition just comes from other rich countries: Canada, the Scandinavian countries, the UK, and the Europeans as well. All of these countries of the OECD, rich countries, have bilateral development agencies like USAID, and all of them also provide a lot of support to multilateral, the UN, the regional development banks, Asian Development Bank, Latin American Development Bank, as well as the IMF and the World Bank, the multilateral institutions. So,
when you work for USAID, are you
Maryland's question.
are you assigned?
Bob, it's my
Yeah.
turn.
Maryland's up.
Okay,
Sorry,
darling. I'm fascinated by the clarity and sophistication of your analysis of what actually helps people in their local area with economic and social development. And I really appreciate some of the things you've said. You mentioned this notion of a golden hour in which a nation or an area is ready to move. So I'm wondering if one of you can speak to an area where my heart is broken daily, can speak to Palestine for a while.
Spent a lot of quality time in Gaza circa 2000, 2001. It's a tough nut to crack, Marilyn, and the reason for that is just how endemic the conflict is, and how the political system on both sides has been captured by more fringe extremist elements. It's the way voting works in the Knesset. Netanyahu and other prime ministers are forced to enter into coalitions with these extremely small, often religious parties that really are on the fringe, and they hold like 3 seats in the Knesset, right? But they're the key to the coalition and forming a government, and so they have outsized influence on what are, Labor and Likud, like Republican and Democrat, are relatively mainstream parties. It depends on your point of view, right? But so, one thing I learned when I worked there for a couple of years is the political system. I talked about Israel, but it's basically the same in Palestine. Since I was there during the second Intifada in 2000, 2001 uprising, and the level of violence was extreme, and things were going boom every morning, suicide bombs and whatnot, and Israeli retaliation. That really gave Hamas a lot of street cred among the population because they were the ones battling the Israelis. And Islamic Jihad, which is a West Bank organization closely associated, both are closely associated with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and of course ultimately Iran. In fact, the USAID at one point, I think 2005, 2006, we were asked to help the Palestinian Authority win an upcoming election, because the fear at the embassy was that Hamas was going to win it. And my response was, well, yeah, they're going to win it. They're the ones been battling the Israelis during the Intifada for 3 or 4 years. It was inevitable that Hamas was going to be voted into power in Gaza. And no amount of work on our part was going to prevent that. So politically speaking, it's the capture by more fringe and extremist elements and their outsized influence in the political process and the politics on both sides. But I think, at this point as well, after 18 months of serious conflict and human suffering, you couldn't really sit down a group of Palestinian and Israelis across the table and expect them to have a reasonable conversation. There needs to be a cooling off period, a period of reconciliation now, a period of ceasefire. And rebuilding. There's not much left in Gaza, but I think the prospects for peace are extremely distant at this point. For now, we'll settle with a ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities, and then when we start hopefully rebuilding Gaza in some way, other than as a American resort or whatever. When we start rebuilding Gaza and Gaza's coming back, then we can start talking about governance. We can start talking about a new security architecture for Gaza that does not include Hamas. We can start talking about Israel and the way that it controls the economy, the airspace, the communications, the ports, and everything else in and out of Gaza, and why the Gazans need, probably a considerably greater degree of autonomy if this conflict is ever going to be resolved. I also think that on both sides, those who are espousing extreme views like we should just relocate all the Palestinians and take over Gaza, the Israelis who say that, I think they need to be marginalized or just sort of the mainstream politically needs to take those people and just sort of shut them up. just to get them out of the conversation. Because the idea that the Palestinians are just going to move to Jordan or Saudi Arabia, or I mean, it's ethnic cleansing, it's genocide, it's a war crime. It's not going to happen voluntarily or involuntarily. At the same time, the notion from the Palestinian side that they can somehow reconstitute a government and a society in Gaza without Hamas and Hamas's influence, to me, that's equally ridiculous. Hamas is not reality. Pardon me?
Marilyn?
Keep going. Okay.
Does that answer your-
one
does that answer your
more?
question? Yeah.
One more question. Okay, nobody spoke up. I'm gonna. What do you know about Haiti? So our understanding is that the international aid has done a especially horrible job there. What do you know about it?
I don't know if I would blame international aid, Max. I'm sure that international aid has contributed to the problems over the years. And, you know, we're talking about going back at least to 1994, you know, if not earlier, the baby doc years. You know, like I said earlier, you know, the fundamental issue in a lot of these problems is one of governance. It's the problem of the state, the government, exercising its monopoly on the use of violence. There is no such monopoly in Haiti. The gangs are, you know, running around freely preying on anyone. I'm sure there are all sorts of kickback schemes and protection rackets and whatnot as well. I frankly would be surprised if there weren't some of that going on in Gaza right now as well. Organized crime is extremely opportunistic. Terrorist organizations are extremely opportunistic. What we're talking about in Haiti is the former. It's criminal gangs and criminal networks that have completely undermined state institutions. So foreign aid could come in and help in the sense of reconstituting a government. We could help in terms of rebuilding, not we aid, but probably the Defense Department or the State Department could help rebuild a civilian police force, for example, which might be a necessity in Haiti. But at the end of the day, Max, it's got to be the Haitians who are demanding this and who are taking action for change. I feel for them, and their history is extremely tragic. But at this juncture, I looked into it about 3-4 years ago when there was a business opportunity in Haiti that the company I was working for was thinking about pursuing. And honestly, the more I looked into it, the more I thought there's just nothing we can do in this case. Because you don't have any freedom of movement, even around Port-au-Prince, without getting preyed upon by these gangs. It's just, it's like Somalia was for a time. Libya has gone through this. Currently, Sudan and South Sudan are undergoing extreme conflict, and are essentially what we in the business call a fragile or a failed state. Haiti is a failed state, and with failed states, short of a major U.S. military intervention and billions of dollars in civilian assistance, there isn't a whole lot we can do except humanitarian assistance, which is trying to just alleviate the human suffering. But that's dealing with the symptoms of the problem, not the causes of the problem.
Which I would say Max is right. I think perhaps not aid is responsible for that situation, but politics, both France, who created the situation at first, and then the US, which had policies, particularly agriculture policies and others, that has created a situation that leads to the sort of symptoms that Nick is talking about. Yeah.
But that said, Max, I remember a day, if you all recall the massive earthquake in Haiti in 2010. Leslie and I were on our way to Pakistan at that point, and we were passing through DC, and we wanted to say hi to the head of AID that we had worked for in Afghanistan, Alonzo Fulgham. And he was up in the operations center with Rajiv Shaw, the incoming aid administrator, dealing with the Haiti earthquake. And, AID AID after that earthquake did God's work in alleviating suffering, clearing rubble, getting the economy up and running again. We even tried to reconstitute a new government. We did all sorts of support after the 2010 earthquake, and yet it seemed like by 2012, by 2013, Haiti was again descending into this sort of chaos that it seems to have a hard time getting itself out of. That was a big intervention. I'm going to guess billions of dollars. The U.S. military was involved, and despite that, again, I mean, I think in some ways, Max, it's hard for me and others to accept, but sometimes you just have to sort of pull back and say there's nothing we can do here.
Right. That's kind of where we've been, as some of our activists in the church have been encouraging for us to just kind of, sit back and see what the Haitians can do. So Leslie and Nick, thank you so much. That was really informative and
you.
brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Peace to you.
I'm going to pray for us. God, we just thank you for Leslie and Nick. We pray for their work and for the government, for the good that we've done and for the bad that we've done. Forgive us and help us to change and help us to hold the line on those things that are beneficial both for our nation and for the world. We pray for all the people we've heard about in this conversation throughout the world that are suffering deeply, and pray that we as a church and as a nation can be instruments of peace. Amen.
Amen to that. Thanks a million, buddy.
Thank
Take
you.
care, y'all. Enjoy your Sunday.
Talk to you soon. I'll give you a ring one of these days. All right. See ya.
That was great, Max. Thanks for bringing him along.
Pretty good, huh?
Yeah, lot to think about. Wow.
His knowledge of the world is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was sitting hearing those stories in Guatemala, and I was like, wow. Just talked to him a couple weeks ago, and I thought, man, I bet the congregation would like to hear this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to listen to him talk in detail about any of these countries for a while.
Yeah.
And Leslie.
A couple more hours would have been great. Yeah. Sorry to bust in.
Thank you, Nigel.
Bye.
Bye.